All right, so welcome to Chris Huelsbeck's Q&A, which is the first one he ever did. This is the first one in the US, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Great. So, no hollering? Come on.
Yeah!
A little bit too much. So, before we get into his career, I should probably just share with you why I'm moderating this panel and the way I do. So, me and Chris are good friends, and I grew up in Norway. I was born in Norway and grew up there. And when I grew up, my neighbor, which was a girl my age, had a Commodore 64 in her basement. And when I was around 4 years old, she gave me a challenge, which was that she wasn't very good at games herself. So if I could complete any game that day, she would give me my first kiss.
No!
So
Did it move on from there?
I was 5 years old.
Okay.
So I frantically looked for a game that I could finish, that I knew I could finish, and I found Giant Sisters. I hadn't really played it before, but it looked like Super Mario. So I figured, I can probably beat this. And I beat it. And that day will always be special to me, because that was the day that I first beat Giant Sisters. Alright. So yes, Chris Huelsbeck is probably the most famous game composer, especially in Europe, but probably in the world too, considering how long his career has been going on. I remember as a kid in magazines from Germany, from the UK, from even Japan, you would have features on Chris Huelsbeck long before this was normal to have game composers. They were kind of a hidden commodity, whereas Chris Huelsbeck was probably the first one that was accessible in this way. So I remember reading many interviews with him when I was around 4 or 5 years old. And the last couple of years, he's become pretty much famous for being the most celebrated video composer in the world, next to Matsu, considering how long his career has been spanning and how much success he's had, which has been many CD projects and even symphonic concerts based solely on his music, and also being the world's first composer, video composer, to get his own symphonic concerts based solely on his work. So we're going to start this panel off at the very beginning. So Chris, can you talk a little bit about your childhood and where you grew up?
Yeah, so I grew up in a family that was very musical. My grandma was a pretty prolific piano teacher, and so we always had like instruments in the house, obviously mostly pianos. And I was already like hacking around on them when I was like 3 or 4 years old. And they tried to teach me the classical way to play the piano for about 2 years or so, but I just didn't agree with the way they were trying to make me play music from classic composers and stuff like that. And I always wanted to kind of play my own melodies and stuff like that. So I started experimenting, and I also, obviously when you're young, you're listening to a lot of music on the radio and stuff like that. And I got into electronic music. I heard this, I think it was like mid-70s, where I heard this popcorn song, this thing. I thought like, wow, these are like really cool sounds. I wanted to know how they were done, and then I got into listening to a lot of other electronic music bands and people like Kraftwerk, Vangelis, Tangerine Dream, and all those. And so from that point on, I was like very involved already in like electronic music was something that I was very interested in, but I was only like 10, 11 years old. And I wanted to obviously try to make music like that myself, but the instruments that were necessary were just unbelievably expensive. So the early synthesizers, they were running, I mean, they started at like several thousand, and my family couldn't afford that. But that has been my dream, and I got like a used electronic organ at some point, and I started composing on that, and I actually do have, let's see here, let's start there. So I have actually still recordings from that organ. I mean, you can imagine me sitting like in my room at 11 years old, having a little tape recorder and you know, trying to record some music without sequences and anything. So I was just like playing on the organ. So I have something here. That was probably the 20th take because I made so many mistakes. But obviously that sound was still pretty limited if I compared it to like you know, Vangelis or Kraftwerk or Jean-Michel Jarre. And so because I didn't have my I couldn't afford a synthesizer, I actually started circuit bending the organ. So I was also into electronics, and I whipped out a soldering iron and I made new connections and stuff like that. And at some point I think it destroyed the organ, but I got a cool couple of cool sounds out of it. And this, for example, is the second piece, so that's like a couple of weeks later, and it sounds already a little bit more synthy.
It died a valiant death, Chris.
Yeah, so that was my adventure with circuit bending, and then I got into computers. And the thing was, as a 13-year-old or so, I was also playing video games. The first games that I played were arcade machines, you know, Pac-Man and stuff like that. But then I got a Atari, the early console. And then I wanted to have my own home computer, that's what it was called back then. And so I saw an ad in the paper about the Commodore 64, and I glanced over it, over all the features and stuff like that. And one thing caught my eye, that was the sound chip description, that it was a real synthesizer sound chip. And so I read, I couldn't believe it. It had all the things that I knew, kind of what a synthesizer would have, was waveforms and filters and stuff like that. And I said, I have to have that. So I started saving money. I was like, you know, delivering newspapers and stuff like that. I was still a little bit short, but my grandma helped me out. And then I got my Commodore 64. And I thought I would like immediately start making music with it, and unfortunately it's not quite that easy. I mean, it's not like today where you have an iPad and you can load up some app and you start making music. It was actually doing nothing. You know, you had to program it. So, and I think for the first year I was just playing games. But I got into programming, so I started with BASIC, and then I thought maybe I could, I mean, music was still going on. I started also with some MIDI instruments at a local music shop and stuff like that, but I still didn't know exactly what I would do with my life. So I thought maybe I could try to get into game development. And so I started designing some games, but they were pretty bad. And also with the basic programming language, you wouldn't get very far. And a friend of mine, he was actually quite good, and he was programming in assembly language. And he had already sold one game. So I got into assembler as well, and that was really cool because you could really like get a lot out of the computer. And I started to develop my first little sound or music playback program. And because my friend, he wasn't good with music. He could design a good game and program it and all that stuff, but he didn't have music. And his second game was taking shape. And that was then my first game music. I made the music for his game. And so this was still before the contest, so I would play that now. So this was already like 2 years later or so from all that organ stuff. Still fairly simple, but it played and my friend was happy and we sold the game. And then I read about the contest.
Yes, so I should explain that in Germany there was a magazine called CC4 magazine, which was actually sold mostly over all of Europe in Germany. It was I think it was the biggest Commodore 64 magazine in Europe at the time. And they often held contests, and this particular contest, which you can explain more about, kind of jumpstart your career.
Right, so it was a contest to create a piece and send it in. It had to be like a program that was running on the computer. It couldn't be just like data of a music program. It had to be actually programmed. And when I saw that, I thought like, oh, this is a cool thing. I'll make a cool piece and send it in, and hopefully I will get on the cover disc, because they had like, I never expected that I would like get anywhere near the top, but I thought maybe I can get one piece onto this cover disc and get some recognition. So I sent it in, and a week later they called me and told me that I won the contest, and I couldn't believe it. I was jumping around all over the house, and my family didn't know what was going on. But yeah, so that was the Shades, and I'll play a couple seconds out of that. Yeah, it's kind of funny how these things work out. I mean, when I composed that piece, I was actually, this is a cool story. I had programmed this driver that was playing this music, and the deadline to send it in was essentially the next day, and I had to compose this piece in one night, and I was still in school, so I started like, I don't know, in the evening, and I worked until like 3, 4 in the morning, and I still had to go to school that day, and it was the deadline to send it in, so I couldn't go to the post office or anything. So I gave it to my parents there and said, you have to get this to the post office. And they didn't know what I was trying to do or what this was about, but they came through and sent it off, and so that was that. And yeah, so where do we go next from there?
Right, so do any of you guys use trackers to make music? So you can applaud. Right, so Chris Huelsbeck actually made sort of like the first modern tracker for Commodore 64, which was called Sound Monitor, which have any of you used Sound Monitor? No? You can leave.
I got a photo of that.
That was an
So-
Amiga thing on my end.
Yeah, well, this was actually on the Commodore 64, and the later tracker that coined the name actually became famous from the Amiga. Yeah. But it used a lot of the concepts that I had in there. This was actually also part of the magazine experience. They had like a listing of the months or something, and I told them I could make something that some normal user could use to create music like I did, and so that project came out of that, and so you could like put in your notes and stuff like that easier.
Did they dim the lights? Because it's hard to see some of your photos. That one is very hard to read.
Yeah, maybe it's just maybe a little bit dark. I don't know how to
Dim the lights, maybe?
It's not that. Yeah, it's not that much to see there anyway. Right. So with that, I actually the magazines were like essential to my career. I saw an ad actually in the small ad section or something where a German games company was looking for people to work with. And that was, the company was called Rainbow Arts, and they were at the time, I think, the largest game developer in Germany.
Yeah, and possibly Europe at the time.
Right, and so I just gave them a call. It's not like today where you go through like a department or something. I just called them up and played them some tunes over the phone. And they hired me on the spot to produce some music for their games. And
do you remember what the first game for Rainbow Arts that you did?
Actually, I think that was called Soldier.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't know if I have actually. No, I don't have an example of that here. But yeah, but with Rainbow Arts, I did a lot of projects. I mean, they quite shaped my early years. We did Genesis.
Yeah, this is where you met Armin Gesert, right?
Right.
And Armin Gesert is the creator of Giant Sisters.
Correct.
Who,
And
I believe he passed away.
yeah, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. He was only 46 or 47, which was very sad. But his legacy lives on. There's new Giant Sisters. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So Giant Sisters was a pretty heavy clone of Super Mario Brothers. You can already tell from the name as well. It was just that Super Mario was not really known in Germany, but the magazines were all swooning over it. Oh, that's the best game and stuff like that. So the developers and bosses from Rainbow Arts, they thought, oh, how can we do something like that? And so Genesis came about. Unfortunately, they pushed it a little bit too far, because in England, when it got released, the distributor put out an ad, "Move over, brothers, here comes the Genesis." And Nintendo didn't like that at all, so they actually threatened a big lawsuit and had Rainbow Arts take the project off the market. But as I said, the legacy lives on, and the newer versions that came out a couple of years ago on Nintendo DS got actually the blessing of Nintendo. So, yeah, so that's that history.
You talked a little bit about synthesizers and stuff earlier. What was your first synthesizer? Like the first real one that you got?
Right. So when I got to Rainbow Arts, I made like a request when they hired me that I would get at least one machine that I could work with, and that was the Ensoniq ESQ1. And I picked that out because it had kind of a workstation feature, one of the first digital synthesizers that could play several sounds at the same time. So it was 8-note polyphone, but you could load up 8 sounds and play each song monophonic or stuff like that. So I could build complete sequences with it. I had a sequencer built in. It was pretty cool instrument for its time. And analog filters, which made it actually sound much better than like a DX7 or so. So that was the first, and I produced a lot of pieces with that. And if you had the time, I would have millions of demos with them. But let's just move on.
Yes.
For a little bit, at the time, I mean, there was no Redbook audio or anything. It was still all programmed music, and I was just, getting to the end of the Commodore 64, and then I started with Amiga. But let's talk a little bit about the Commodore 64. So one thing I did in the later days was just like getting more out of the soundtrack and more samples. So I created a system and built my own hardware sampler that we stuck on a user port where I sampled sounds and put those in onto the music. And I got one in this example. By the way, that was the girlfriend of the boss of Rainbow Eyes.
Was the creator of Turrican and many other games, but mostly known for Turrican. So talk a little bit about meeting him.
Yeah, so Manfred was a very strange fella, but he had like really a thing for action arcade games, and we were like going to the arcades every other day basically, and we played all the action games there. I don't know, 1941, and so horizontal, side-scrolling, whatever you could find, and so shooters. And he did like a kind of this Katakis thing that was kind of like an R-type, and then he moved on to create Tarkin, which was, when you look at like screenshots, very much inspired by Psychonix Oscar, which is like a less well-known arcade machine. But yeah, it was, and at the time I was actually not working that much with him anymore. He was still on the Commodore 64, and I had already met the guys from Factor 5, and they were doing the Amiga versions for Rainbow Arts of a lot of games. And among them R-Type, by the way, which was just before we got really into Tarragon and that stuff. And as a little side note for the R-Type, which was also one of my last Commodore 64 projects, by the way, I wanted to create a different type of music that was more based on kind of film music sounds, because I was also very much becoming interested in film music in general. So like John Williams is my biggest idol there, I think. And so I got more studio hardware, among them the Korg M1 workstation, which is, oh yeah, you love it. It's still around actually as a plugin, it's very good. So let's maybe listen in here on the R-Type title for the Amiga.
You became extremely famous for your own audio editor and driver, which was TFMX.
TFMX was like was the next step after the sound monitor essentially.
Right.
So I started on the Commodore 64, but then moved it over to the Amiga. And central thing, I don't know if I actually have a picture of that was the Commodore 64 version, but this thing, that was what set it apart from other sound editors, which was a scripting language for sounds. So what you could do is you could change all the parameters of the sound chip in the script with every cycle of whatever that driver was triggered, if you wanted to, and you could build loops and stuff like that, and create sounds that were otherwise not possible, or you couldn't think of it. If you made a sound driver that could only create a certain sound, then that was fixed. But with this, you could actually change it, and which each node that was triggered, one of these scripts would run. And I used this concept on the Amiga as well, and actually also later on the Nintendo 64 with the music's sound system. Yeah. And that worked really well for this chip sound. You could get a lot out of the machine.
Which games did you use that on? What was the first game that you used TFMX on?
I'm not exactly sure. I think it may have been definitely on R-Type,
Right.
Commodore 64. Katakis was still sound monitor. And I have actually a little sample here. So this was actually not with samples, this was just the sound chip with the TFMX language or scripts. Break that down, that's still 3 voices, but it sounds like, I don't know, 5 or 6 because of all the drums and stuff that are interleaved, and that scripting language made that possible.
So, you guys have played Turrican, right?
Yeah.
Alright, so talk a little bit about it. So, yeah, how did you get into Turrican and kind of the work process on that title?
Yeah, so my involvement was actually mostly with the Amiga version, and I was totally into the samples, obviously. I had four voices, 8-bit samples, and so you could create a lot of different sounds. I was just having fun with it. I wanted it to be arcadey, kind of inspired a little bit by what I heard from Japanese arcade productions. So it was kind of rock music meets synth, that kind of style, and just had fun with it. And it became like a quite long running series that went over several years, and became very successful with the fans. And to this day, probably my best known work. Yeah, actually from Turrican 2, maybe we're also running out of time actually, is the Turrican 2 title, which used also another enhancement of the sound chip. Instead of 4 voices, we created 7. A guy from the Atari ST actually helped me with that, because he had created some programming that would emulate the Amiga sound chip on the Atari ST, and I thought, wow, if I could take that piece of code and rework it that it runs again on the Amiga, I could create the 4 voices mixed down onto 1, and then have still 3 more Amiga voices in full quality or whatever available. So that's how my 7-voice system came about. And this is the intro of the Turrican 2 title. That was the first piece I did with that technology.
You know, you're free to come up and dance. Yeah, so we're just gonna like skip around so we make everything time.
Right.
Yeah, so you left Rainbow Arts eventually, and you founded your own game company with some friends, right? Which was Kaiko?
Kaiko was the label for the games, and the company was called Audios.
Right. So this game company was kind of interesting because you tried to kind of emulate Japanese games very much. Can you talk a little bit about which Japanese composers you were kind of inspired by at this time?
Well, first and foremost, of course, Yuzo Koshiro, because that when I heard that ActRaiser on the Super Nintendo, I thought, okay, game over. I can pack up and go home. No, but yeah, definitely. I mean, all these arcade machines. I actually don't know most of the composers there, but there was one, the Darius game. I played that a lot, and that was rocking, and just a lot of console titles that came out where we played everything, and yeah. But
you also had Japanese consoles in the office, right?
right, and the whole idea of Kaiko, which is kind of like a little bit of a take on Taito, just like two levels changed, but we wanted to just try to emulate their style because we thought this was like really cool what was coming out of Japan, and just create that over in Germany or in Europe. Because I mean, we imported these machines, they were just starting to get into the European market, but really most people didn't know of them, and we just wanted to bring that kind of experience to the Amiga fans.
Most famously Apedia, right?
Right, which was kind of like a Gradius style gameplay, but we just changed, you know, the graphics and stuff like that.
I believe Apedia was also the first European game to get its own soundtrack CD, is that correct? It was
Yeah.
one of the first.
Correct. That was because I had like released my first CD album a year before Apedia came out, and it was pretty successful for a non-label release. I mean, we manufactured CDs ourselves, and we actually sold them at trade shows and through mail order. And we sold, I think, in the first year 11,000 of them. And that was pretty remarkable, actually financed the whole company for a while. And we built a little audio studio and kept producing CDs, and the soundtrack for Apedia was an obvious choice. And we also got into a little bit of pop music production. It wasn't quite as successful, but yeah, just had fun at the time.
You also started freelancing a little bit at this time, and you did Gym Power?
Yeah, I did just like projects on the side for other companies, audio and music services.
That was a French game, was it?
It was a French company, and also kind of an arcade side-scrolling platformer.
So back then, this was before internet obviously, but how did publishers and developers around like the world contact you at this time? How did you get these different shows?
Yeah, they definitely, it was all over the phone, so they called me up, and I don't know where they even got the phone number, didn't advertise or anything. Maybe you got one of the CDs, that could be. phone number was in there. And he asked if I would like be interested in making music for one of their projects, and so we made a deal, and that was Jim Power. Also got quite successful. The game was horribly hard to play, but yeah, and just kept on working from there.
So, into the 90s, you also did your first CD audio project, which was Tunnel B1, which was also a video game on PlayStation, right?
Correct. So PlayStation was really the first mainstream console that was sold all over the world that had a CD drive where you could actually do Redbook, what you call Redbook audio. So the music would play essentially streamed from the disc, just as you would like produce the music in the studio for film or whatever. You could produce the game music that way, and obviously I was very interested in that, and yeah, just try to create like a more cinematic experience. Did you want to play something like that? I don't know. I have to go somewhere else.
By the way, if anyone has questions, feel free to go up to the microphone.
Yeah, I think we're far enough in that we can start.
Next question.
Yeah.
What would you say your greatest inspiration for the kind of music you make? Because I know that I've heard a lot of your soundtracks over the years. I fell in love with Giannis Sisters when I was a little girl. And everything you make just has a distinctive sound to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like pop music obviously was my first influence. I think my first album was the Beatles.
Right.
That Red and Blue album or something, that double. There were still records at the time. Those weren't CDs or anything. So, but also like the electronic legends, you know, like Jean-Michel Jarre, Tangerine Dream and stuff like that. And then later film music composers, you know, John Williams, Jerry Goldsmith, guys like that. And I always, like, when we were growing up in Germany, almost all the pop music was actually English singing, and until later in school, I didn't understand what they were singing about, so I never developed like an ear for lyrics. So I never thought of a song as something that has a message behind it or a story or something. For me, it was all about the melody, and that's what kind of like shaped my work. I'm very much into memorable melodies, and you know, just something that I don't know how to do. I just do what I like myself, and luckily enough, other people like it too. So.
Thank you.
Alright, so we'll continue a little bit. Jump to you.
Yeah, so let's just have a quick listen here into the intro of Tunnel B1, which was that first CD game that I did.
and you became the composer on Star Wars Rogue Squadron, most famously for that, and also composed the Rogue Squadron theme. Was it?
Yes.
Yes, which is quite popular Star Wars track right now, and kind of accepted by the Star Wars fans as like an official Star Wars
Yeah,
piece of music.
unfortunately that was never released anywhere on CD
No.
because they can't actually release Star Wars music on CD that's not made by John Williams.
Yes.
Unwritten rule. I think it happened because they put out an album a couple of years before some game that they did or some story where some other composer was invited, and it created a huge stink with John Williams, and since then they're not doing it anymore. So.
But when you worked on Star Wars, how was the involvement from LucasArts in your music? Were you free, or did you have like very specific things you had to do?
No, I think I got the gig mainly because they wanted to make the game on the Nintendo 64, which didn't have a CD. It was cartridge based, and so we needed to make like a sequence soundtrack with samples and MIDI essentially, so that kind of a system. And since I had the experience of getting the most out of such a limited thing, they hired me for that, and it was quite an honor, and I was also very intimidated because I'm a huge fan of John Williams, and I don't think I'm anywhere near as good a composer as he is, but I tried my best to get into the spirit of the Star Wars universe and create something that works for the game.
So, yeah, we can take a question now.
Good morning. Just wanted to say I'm a huge fan of all your work, mostly, specifically Jim Power. And I actually have a weird two-part question. We didn't have an Amiga here growing up. I know it was more popular in Europe and the UK. So the first experience that I ever had with Jim Power was actually the port that came over to Super Nintendo. Jim Power Lost Dimension in 3D. Apparently there was a version that came out for the Genesis or the Mega Drive that was never actually released. So my question is, did you do the music on the Super Nintendo and I know you did the music on the Amiga version, but did you also do like either additional tracks or the versions for Super Nintendo and Genesis? And if you did, what did you feel in terms of technicality, the differences between the chips? What did you feel was easier to use?
Yeah, definitely. The Super Nintendo chip was actually pretty cool. It had 8 voices instead of 4, and you could do pretty cool quality samples on them. It had some limitations with like looping and stuff like that of sounds. They had to be on certain like block boundaries and stuff like that. But overall, I enjoyed the work on there because you had more voices, and yeah, it was just cool. And then the Genesis was a whole different beast because of that FM sound chip. But we also, our driver, our sound driver, did a little bit more. We had actually there's the Sega Master System sound chip in there too. So, and you can use those parallel, and also there's one channel of digital audio which you can switch to either center or left or right. And we mixed 2 additional voices on that using the C80 processor, which was actually, the interesting part about that was it was actually not permitted by the rules of Sega, but for some reason, when they heard it, what we did, they let it slide. Because we had essentially then 11 or 12 voices on this thing. So with the 6 voice FM and the 4 voices from the PSG, and then 2 samples. And still to this day, I really enjoy listening to the Genesis versions of the soundtracks. I don't know exactly about the Jim Power one. He said it was never released. I actually wasn't quite aware, or I don't remember exactly how that went. And I I don't know if that soundtrack ever made it anywhere or if it came out. Do you know anything about it?
I've never heard anything from it actually. I just looked it up and found out that there was a Genesis port.
What happened was that the Genesis port was canceled and they leaked the prototype ROM, which had one song in it, which was the level 3 song.
And it's very much possible that that is the only song that I converted.
Right. Probably.
Okay. Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so moving on a little bit, as I mentioned at the top, Chris was celebrated in Germany in 2008 with his very own symphonic show produced by the WDR Orchestra, Radio Orchestra, and Thomas Becker, who is a very famous concert producer. This was the first video game composer to actually get his very own symphonic show based on only his work. In Japan, you had shows where Nugumatsu was celebrated and stuff like that, but there was always other people involved. So Chris Huelsbeck was the very first in the world to be celebrated on his own.
I didn't even know that.
Yes. And now we know. And also, this was the very first video game symphony to be broadcasted on radio. It was broadcasted locally in Germany and also on the web wide. So, and had huge numbers in Germany. And one of the most popular radio broadcast music that year, in fact. So, in Germany, this guy is quite famous. So, I think you have some pictures and demos from Symphonic Shade, so you guys can see.
What should we play, R-Type or Jana Sisters?
Not turkey too sweet.
I
Power.
would for Jana Sisters maybe for now. Jim Power is actually
Jim
very
Power.
cool.
Yeah,
User
so-
Koshiro arranged that.
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe we should listen in there. I mean, to honor.
One John's
which was actually arranged by Jonna Balton from Finland, who is an amazing guy too. also on Spotify, so you can
Yes.
check it out. You know.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, your career spanned so many different generations of consoles, and so you've gone from the FM synthesis to samples and then finally to writing book. I was wondering if any of those transitions have affected how you approach writing a piece or the form of the pieces that you write.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with each generation, especially in those times when the features were so limited, you would get like new features and stuff like that, and that would very much influence your writing. Especially when you compare like going from Commodore 64 to the Amiga, where the former you have like only these synthesizer sounds, and then on the Amiga you had samples, so you could really sample like trumpet and stuff like that. So that definitely influences how you write something. But I think like my style is still, I mean, it developed over time, but it's very melodic. That's what I would say is my main strength. Thank you.
You founded your own production company, Chris Huelsbeck Productions, and you were able to revisit many of your classics again now after Savant Chase. And so there's two specific projects that right now are very popular and very exciting, which the first one was just released, which is John Sister's Twisted Dreams. Did any of you buy that?
It was on tour.
Alright, so, and the other one, which we will also look at, is Chris's Kickstarter for Turrican soundtrack. So, we can start with John Sister's Twisted Dreams.
Right. So with the reboot of Giant Sisters, after Armin's passing, the company still went on, and they were very much involved also in the creation of the Giant Sisters DS, and they just fell in love with the IP, and they decided they want to try again to the next generation. And they started talking to me about 1.5 years ago, and what they wanted to do is to emphasize the switch between the two states of the character more. So in the new game, actually the whole world transforms when you get that, if you say like a power up, and the character actually transforms from the sweet girl to the punk girl, and so the whole environment transforms. And when I heard about that, and then I also saw like early demos of it, I thought, wow, this is an opportunity to really do something with the music